A kind-hearted cashier helps a struggling mother, only to be fired and humiliated for his generosity. Just when all hope seems lost, Big Shaq steps in, turning the tables in a way no one expects. Justice, power, and redemption collide, as one act of kindness sparks a massive change. But when the truth comes out, who will really face the consequences? Watch till the end, for a twist you won't see coming. Before we deep dive into this interesting story, subscribe to our channel and tell us where are you watching from. Share in the comments below. The supermarket buzzed with end-of-the-day exhaustion. Employees moved mechanically, scanning barcodes and bagging groceries under the fluorescent lights that hummed overhead. It was late, and everyone just wanted to finish their shift and go home. Among them was Noah Carter, a young cashier with a tired but warm smile, punching in the final hours of his shift. He had been working here for months, long enough to understand the unspoken rules of survival in retail. Keep your head down, do your job, and don't get involved. But tonight, he broke that rule. Across his register stood Jessica Lane, a woman in her early 30s with worn-out eyes and an anxious grip on her purse. Beside her, a little boy, no older than 5, clung to her coat, his small fingers tugging at the fabric. His round, innocent eyes darted between his mother and the items on the conveyor belt, a loaf of bread, a carton of milk, some canned soup. Essentials, bare minimums. Jessica swallowed hard as the total flashed on the screen. $28.74. She reached into her purse, counting the wrinkled bills and spare change she had. Her face fell. She was short. Her hands trembled slightly as she pushed aside the soup cans. I'll just take these instead. Noah's chest tightened. He had seen this scene too many times, a parent trying to stretch every dollar, a child watching silently, learning far too young what struggle looked like. The boy's small voice broke through the tension. "Mommy, I'm hungry." Jessica forced a smile, kneeling beside him. "I know, sweetheart. We'll eat soon, I promise." Noah felt something inside him snap. Enough. Before he could overthink it, he reached into his own pocket, pulled out a few crumpled bills, and discreetly punched them into the register. The total dropped. Jessica blinked in confusion. "Wait. I thought—" Noah smiled softly and handed her the bag. "Must have been a discount. You're all set." For a moment, she just stared at him. Then tears welled in her eyes. She exhaled a shaky breath, nodding quickly. "Thank you. Thank you so much." She grabbed her son's hand and hurried toward the exit. Noah watched them go, warmth spreading through his chest. But that warmth vanished the second a sharp voice cut through the air. The break room door slammed shut behind him, the fluorescent lights overhead casting a harsh glare. Victor Kane, the store manager, stood behind his desk, arms crossed, eyes full of contempt. He was a man who valued profit over people, policy over decency. Noah barely had time to react before Victor threw a receipt onto the desk. "Do you think this place is a charity, Carter?" Noah stared at the receipt. It showed the exact amount he had covered for Jessica. "It was just a few dollars." Noah started, his voice calm but firm. Victor's expression darkened. "It was theft." Noah's jaw clenched. "I wasn't stealing. I was helping." Victor scoffed. "Helping? And who helps the company when employees start giving away free groceries? You think that woman will come back and spend more just because you felt sorry for her?" Noah fisted his hands at his sides, fighting the urge to snap. It wasn't about business. It was about doing the right thing. Victor laughed dryly. "The right thing doesn't pay the bills." He stepped closer, his voice dropping. "You broke policy, and in my store that means you're done." Noah's stomach dropped. "Wait, what?" Victor grabbed a piece of paper from his desk and slammed it onto the table. "Sign it, your termination notice." Noah's hands trembled as he looked at the paper. "Sir, please. I need this job." Victor didn't flinch. "You should have thought about that before you decided to play hero." Noah felt like the air had been sucked out of the room. His mind raced. Rent was due next week. His younger sister depended on him. He had given up college to work full-time, to keep their lives stable after their parents passed away. This job was everything. His voice cracked. "I was just trying to help a mother feed her kid. Victor's lips curled into a sneer. And now, you can figure out how to feed yourself. You're fired. Noah's breath hitched. His vision blurred for a second, but he refused to let the tears fall. With shaking hands, he grabbed a pen and signed the paper. He had no choice. Victor snatched it back, barely glancing at it before opening the door. Now get out. Noah grabbed his jacket and walked toward the door, his heartbeat thudding in his ears. He stepped into the store, humiliation burning his skin. And that's when he saw the crowd. The confrontation had been loud enough to draw attention. Employees had gathered near the registers, whispering among themselves. Some looked away, uncomfortable. Others, like Jessica, stood frozen, horror and guilt written all over their faces. Noah lowered his head, avoiding eye contact. He didn't want their pity. But then, a deep, commanding voice broke the silence. Hold up. The store fell completely silent. Noah turned, and his breath caught. A massive figure stepped forward, towering over everyone. Big Shaq. For the first time since this nightmare began, Victor Kane looked nervous. Shaq crossed his arms, eyes locked on Victor. His presence alone shifted the entire atmosphere. You just fired him, Shaq said, his voice calm but heavy. For helping someone in need? Victor stiffened. This is none of your business. Shaq tilted his head. See, that's where you're wrong. Noah watched in stunned silence. The next few moments, they were about to change everything. The door to Victor Kane's office swung open violently, the sound echoing through the store like a gunshot. Noah Carter stumbled forward, his breath uneven, his hands clenched at his sides. His mind raced, but his body moved on autopilot, his legs carrying him out into the bright, unforgiving light of the supermarket floor. The scent of cleaning chemicals and freshly stocked produce did nothing to calm the storm brewing inside him. Behind him, Victor followed, his presence suffocating. He didn't just fire Noah behind closed doors, he wanted to make a statement. The second the employees saw Noah's face, pale, devastated, his lips pressed together like he was holding back every ounce of emotion in his body, they knew something was wrong. Victor didn't waste a second. Attention, everyone, he called, his voice sharp, cutting through the chatter of customers unloading their carts. A few heads turned, then a few more. The store went still. Noah wanted to disappear. This young man, Victor continued, his lips curling with contempt, thought he could take money out of this company's pocket and give it away like it was his to spend. Murmurs rippled through the employees standing behind their registers. A few looked away, shame flickering in their eyes. Others shifted uncomfortably, afraid to react. Jessica Lane stood frozen near the entrance, her shopping bags hanging limply at her sides. Her son, gripping her sleeve, stared up at Noah, his little brows furrowing in confusion. Noah tried to swallow, but his throat was dry. His pulse thundered in his ears. Victor wasn't done. This store, he continued, pacing slowly, theatrically, has rules. And when someone steals from us, they face consequences. He gestured toward Noah. And the consequence is this. Effective immediately, he is fired. The finality of those words hit Noah like a punch to the gut. He had known it was coming, but hearing it out loud, in front of everyone, was something else entirely. For a second, no one moved. Then, Jessica stepped forward. That's not fair. Her voice wasn't loud, but it carried. Victor's gaze snapped toward her. Excuse me? Jessica's hands trembled slightly as she shifted her son behind her, shielding him instinctively. He wasn't stealing, she said, her voice steady but tight. He was helping me. Victor raised a brow. And why exactly should I care? Jessica's lips parted slightly, stunned by the blunt cruelty of the question. This man, she said, gesturing toward Noah, was the only person in this entire store who saw me struggling and did something about it. And for that, you humiliate him? Victor scoffed. This is a business, not a charity. Jessica's face burned with frustration. So, if I was $1 short, you'd rather let my son go hungry than let a decent human being step in to help? Victor's smirk widened. Yes. A cold, suffocating silence settled over the store. Jessica looked around, searching for someone, anyone, to back her up. The employees avoided her gaze. The customers shuffled awkwardly. No one spoke. Fear. That's what she saw in their faces. Victor had created that fear, and he fed on it. Jessica's jaw clenched as she turned back to Noah, her eyes now filled with regret. "I'm so sorry," she whispered. Noah shook his head, forcing a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "It's okay." But it wasn't. It wasn't okay at all. Victor sighed dramatically. "Enough of this." He turned back to Noah, his voice dripping with condescension. "Pack your things and get out." Noah felt his chest tighten. He wouldn't beg. He wouldn't cry. He inhaled slowly, squared his shoulders, and gave Victor one last look. Not one of defeat, but quiet defiance. Then, without another word, he walked toward the break room. With every step, the humiliation burned hotter, like 1,000 eyes were on him, stripping him of his dignity. He gathered his jacket from his locker, the same jacket he had worn every shift for months, the same jacket that now felt heavier than ever. Noah glanced at the small name tag still pinned to his uniform. Noah Carter, customer service representative. A bitter chuckle escaped his lips. Customer service. Apparently, helping a customer meant you were disposable. He pulled the tag off and shoved it into his pocket. As he stepped back onto the floor, the whispers started again. Employees sneaking glances, customers murmuring to themselves. Jessica's son clutching her arm, eyes filled with innocent confusion. Noah kept his head down, gripping his bag strap tightly. Just a few more steps and he'd be out of there. Then, a deep, commanding voice cut through the air. "Hold up." Noah froze. So did everyone else. The murmurs died instantly, and a sudden, sharp stillness settled over the store. Noah turned his head slowly, and that's when he saw him. Big Shaq. Standing tall, arms crossed, expression unreadable. His presence alone shifted the entire energy of the room. Noah felt a chill crawl up his spine. What was he doing here? Victor, oblivious, turned toward Shaq with his usual arrogant smirk. "And you are?" Shaq took a slow step forward, his towering frame impossible to ignore. His eyes locked onto Victor. "A customer," he said, voice calm but firm. "One who just saw a man get fired for doing the right thing." Victor's smirk faltered for the first time. "This is none of your concern." Shaq tilted his head slightly. "See? That's where you're wrong." Noah swallowed hard, watching the power shift in real time. Victor crossed his arms. "You don't understand how business works." Shaq chuckled under his breath. "Oh, I understand business just fine." He turned slightly, glancing at Noah, then back at Victor. A small, knowing smile played on his lips. Victor narrowed his eyes. "What?" Shaq took another step forward, lowering his voice just enough to make the tension unbearable. "You just made the biggest mistake of your career." Noah felt his breath catch, and from the way Victor paled slightly, he felt it too. The air in the supermarket was thick with tension. Every single person, employees, customers, even the security guard by the entrance, stood frozen, eyes locked on the scene unfolding before them. Noah Carter stood at the center of it all, his head slightly bowed, his face a mask of frustration and disbelief. His fingers tightened around the strap of his bag, his knuckles turning white as he struggled to keep his emotions in check. The humiliation of being fired in front of everyone still clung to him like a weight he couldn't shake off. But then, there was him. The towering presence of Big Shaq had shifted the energy in the store in a way no one could ignore. His voice, deep, unshaken, cut through the silence like a blade. "You really fired a man for showing kindness?" Shaq's gaze never wavered from Victor Kane, the smug, self-righteous manager standing at the front of the registers. "That's how you run things around here?" Victor, oblivious to the storm he had just walked into, chuckled dryly, his confidence still intact. "And who exactly do you think you are?" His arms crossed over his chest, his lips curling into a smirk. "This is store policy. He gave away company money, and that's called theft. I don't owe anyone an explanation." Shaq exhaled through his nose, shaking his head slightly, as if he were trying to contain his disappointment. Store policy? He repeated, his voice calm but carrying an unmistakable edge. His next words were slow, deliberate. And what about human decency? A murmur ran through the crowd. Employees who had remained silent moments ago exchanged glances, uncertainty creeping into their expressions. Some of them had been working under Victor for years, enduring his ruthless, cutthroat leadership, but they had never seen someone stand up to him like this, especially not in front of customers. Victor, however, wasn't intimidated. Not yet. Listen, pal, I don't care who you are, but this isn't your business. He waved a dismissive hand. You want to help the kid? Fine, go start a charity. But in my store, we follow the rules. Shaq let out a small chuckle, not of amusement, but of disbelief. He took a slow step forward, closing the space between him and Noah. Without saying another word, he reached into his jacket and pulled out a thick stack of cash. The store gasped in unison. Victor's smirk twitched, and for the first time, a flicker of uncertainty crossed his face. Shaq turned to Noah, who was still staring at the stack in disbelief, his brow furrowed. You're not walking away empty-handed. Shaq extended the money toward him, his tone leaving no room for argument. Noah blinked, his throat tightening. I can't take that. Yes, you can, Shaq said simply. The whispers in the crowd grew louder. Customers standing in line had stopped checking out their groceries entirely, their focus entirely on the confrontation. Jessica, standing just a few feet away, covered her mouth with her hand. Her eyes were glassy with emotion. She had felt nothing but guilt since Noah had been fired for helping her. Now, watching this stranger step in so effortlessly, it was overwhelming. Victor, recovering from his brief moment of unease, scoffed loudly. Oh, I see what this is, he said, shaking his head, his smirk returning. You think throwing money at a problem makes you some kind of hero? He let out a dry chuckle. That's not how the world works. Shaq's lips curled into a slow smirk. No, he said, slipping his hands back into his pockets. But what happens next might. Victor's smirk faltered. Excuse me? Shaq tilted his head slightly, as if he were studying Victor like a problem he was about to solve. You really don't recognize me, do you? Victor's brows pulled together. Recognize you? Why the hell would I? Then it clicked. His face drained of color. His lips parted slightly, but no words came out. His posture stiffened. Shaq had seen this reaction before, the moment someone realized they had just made the biggest mistake of their lives. I suggest you start choosing your words carefully, Shaq continued, his voice unwavering, because you just fired someone in front of a very large audience, and I'm just getting started. Jessica, still stunned, whispered under her breath. Who is he? A nearby employee, their voice shaky with realization, answered. That's Shaquille Turner, they murmured. He's one of the biggest investors in this company. Jessica's eyes widened. Several other employees visibly tensed. But the person who reacted the worst? Victor. He stumbled back half a step, his entire demeanor shifting. That's not possible, he stammered. I would have known. Shaq let out a low, unimpressed chuckle. Would you? He raised an eyebrow. Or have you been so busy treating employees like they're disposable that you didn't notice who was walking through your store this whole time? The whispers turned into full-blown shock. Employees who had previously been afraid to speak now exchanged looks of both amazement and amusement. Customers pulled out their phones, recording the moment, realizing that something big was happening. Victor, once so smug and confident, was now sweating. Shaq took another step forward, and though his voice was steady, calm, composed, there was no mistaking the authority behind it. You humiliated a man in front of his coworkers for doing something good, he said. You paraded him like an example. But the only example here is you. His gaze hardened. You are the reason companies fail. Victor opened his mouth, then shut it. He was trapped. Shaq pulled his phone from his pocket and pressed a single button. I think it's time we make a call, he said casually. Let's see how corporate feels about how you're running their stores. Victor went pale. Jessica held her breath. Noah, standing at Shaq's side, felt his entire world tilt. This wasn't just some small argument anymore. This was the moment everything changed. The crowd waited, breathless. Because now, it wasn't about whether or not Noah deserved his job back. It was about whether Victor would have one at all. The supermarket, once buzzing with the usual hum of cash registers and murmuring customers, now felt like a courtroom waiting for a verdict. The tension was thick, the air charged with anticipation. Employees and customers alike stood frozen in place, their gazes locked on the unfolding confrontation. Noah, still in shock from the last few minutes, barely registered the weight of the cash Shaq had handed him. His heart pounded as he tried to process everything that was happening. Victor Kane, the smug, self-important store manager, was no longer grinning. His confidence had started to slip, but he still held on to the belief that this was just some power play, some empty threat from a customer who thought he had influence. That belief shattered the moment Shaq reached into his pocket and pulled out his phone. The move was simple, almost casual, but the effect was instantaneous. Without hesitation, Shaq dialed a number and pressed the phone to his ear. The way he did it, calm, deliberate, made it clear that whoever was on the other end of that call held real power. Victor's throat bobbed as he swallowed. Who are you calling? His voice was forced, like he was trying to keep control of a situation that was already slipping away. Shaq didn't answer. He simply waited, the line ringing once before a voice answered on the other end. Yeah, it's me, Shaq said, his tone smooth but firm. We've got a problem at one of your locations. I need you to get down here, now. Victor's smirk completely vanished. The call lasted no longer than 10 seconds, but the impact rippled through the store. Shaq slipped his phone back into his pocket, his eyes never leaving Victor's. I'd start thinking about what you're gonna say when they get here. Victor's lips pressed into a thin line. He let out a short, dry laugh, but his fingers twitched at his sides. You're bluffing, he said, though his voice wavered just enough to betray his nerves. Shaq raised an eyebrow, tilting his head slightly. You really think so? Minutes passed. Then, the doors of the supermarket swung open. The change was immediate. 3 men in tailored suits entered the store, their presence demanding attention. They weren't just lawyers. They were corporate officials, the people who made decisions at the highest levels. Every employee standing near the registers visibly tensed. Victor? He turned white. One of the men, a tall, silver-haired executive with sharp eyes and an even sharper suit, walked in with an air of authority. His gaze scanned the store before landing on Shaq. The tension in his shoulders eased slightly, and he stepped forward, offering a firm handshake. Shaquille, he greeted, his voice carrying the weight of respect. Didn't expect to see you here. Victor's stomach dropped. Shaq shook the executive's hand. Didn't expect to be here, he admitted, but I couldn't ignore what was happening. The executive's sharp gaze flicked to Victor. I assume you're the manager? Victor cleared his throat, his hands clenching into fists. Yes, sir. I manage this location. The executive nodded once before turning back to Shaq. What exactly is the issue? Shaq exhaled slowly, looking around the store. At Noah, still gripping his bag like he didn't belong there. At Jessica, her hands trembling as she held onto her son. At the employees, all watching but too afraid to speak up. Then he turned back to the executive. I just watched this man fire one of your employees, Shaq said, nodding toward Victor, for helping a struggling mother cover her groceries. The executive's expression barely changed, but the slight narrowing of his eyes suggested he was already making calculations. Is that true? Victor stiffened. He hesitated for a second too long, then shook his head. It's not that simple. The employee in question was caught violating store policy. He was giving away merchandise. Shaq cut him off. A few dollars worth of groceries. Victor's jaw tightened. Shaq's voice remained even, but there was an undeniable edge to it now. So let me get this straight. You fired a man for helping a mother feed her kid, but I'll bet you've never fired anyone for cutting corners, overcharging, or pocketing a little extra cash at the end of a shift. A murmur ran through the employees. Several of them exchanged glances, their faces confirming exactly what Shaq had suspected. Victor took a step forward, his confidence returning in the form of anger. I don't appreciate you coming in here and acting like you own the place. Shaq smirked. That's funny. He paused for dramatic effect, then added, because I do. The silence that followed was thick, suffocating. Victor's mouth opened slightly, but no words came out. Shaq tilted his head slightly, watching as reality dawned on Victor in real time. The manager stumbled back a step, his confidence crumbling like a sandcastle in a storm. The executive crossed his arms. Victor, I'm going to ask you one question, he said, his tone cool, collected. How long have you been working at this location? Victor hesitated. 10 years. And in those 10 years, how many times have you been called to a corporate meeting to discuss employee complaints? Victor's mouth snapped shut. Shaq raised an eyebrow. That many, huh? The executive sighed, glancing at Shaq before making his final decision. This isn't the first report we've had about this store, he said. But it's the first time we've had it confirmed by someone we trust. He turned back to Victor, his voice firm. Effective immediately. You're terminated. Gasps erupted from the employees. Victor's face twisted in horror. Wait, no, you can't do that. The executive's stare was unyielding. Actually, I can. A security guard, who had remained on the sidelines until now, finally stepped forward. Sir, I'm going to have to ask you to leave. Victor looked around frantically, as if someone would come to his rescue. But there was no one. He had burned too many bridges. With no other choice, he stormed toward the exit. His face burned with humiliation, his hands shaking with rage. He pushed past the customers, past the employees who had once feared him but now stood a little taller. As he reached the door, Shaq's voice called after him, one final blow before the chapter closed. Oh, and Victor? Victor paused but didn't turn around. Shaq smirked. You punish kindness, but you reward greed. That ends today. Victor said nothing, and then he was gone. A moment of stunned silence followed before applause erupted. The employees, once terrified of speaking up, now had nothing to fear. Jessica, still overwhelmed, turned to Shaq, her eyes glistening with gratitude. I don't even know how to thank you, Shaq smiled. You don't have to. The tension in the store hadn't fully settled, but one thing was clear. Victor Kane was finished. His face, once smug and full of arrogance, was now twisted in disbelief. His eyes darted between Shaq, the corporate officials, and the employees, looking for some way out. But there was none. The regional director, a tall man in his mid-50s with sharp eyes and a no-nonsense demeanor, turned to the security guard near the front entrance. Escort him out, he ordered firmly. Victor's nostrils flared, his chest rising and falling rapidly. Wait, this is ridiculous. You can't fire me like this. I've been running this store for 10 years. The director barely glanced at him. And in those 10 years, you've created a culture of fear and toxicity. You've ignored complaints, mistreated employees, and let greed take priority over people. He exhaled, shaking his head. Frankly, we should have done this sooner. Victor's fingers curled into fists. This is a mistake, he growled. Shaq smirked. Number keeping you around was the mistake. A ripple of murmured agreement ran through the employees standing behind the registers. Victor turned on them, his face contorted in anger. Oh, now you all have something to say? When I was in charge, you all kept your mouths shut. One of the cashiers, a young woman named Riley who had worked under Victor for years, took a small step forward. Her voice was quiet, but steady. We kept our mouths shut because we were afraid. She lifted her chin. Not anymore. Victor's sneer faltered. Noah, still standing near Shaq, watched it all unfold in disbelief. Just a few minutes ago, he had been the one walking out of this store humiliated, feeling like a failure. Now, the man who fired him was the one being dragged out in disgrace. Security moved in, gripping Victor's arm. Sir, you need to leave. Victor yanked his arm back. I can walk on my own, he snapped, his voice seething with fury. He took one last look around the store. The employees who had once feared him now standing tall. The customers who had ignored him now watching with interest. And Shaq, the man who single-handedly destroyed everything he had built. Victor's face burned with humiliation as he turned on his heel and stormed toward the exit. The moment he stepped out, the entire store erupted into cheers. Noah stood in stunned silence, taking it all in. This didn't feel real. A few minutes ago, he had been packing his things, thinking he'd have to start all over. Now, he had a second chance. Jessica approached him first, her son still gripping her hand. Her eyes were glassy with unshed tears. "Noah," she said softly. I don't even know what to say. I feel like this is all my fault." Noah shook his head immediately. "Don't say that. You didn't do anything wrong." Jessica exhaled shakily. "But you lost your job because of me. And now..." She looked around at the store, still processing everything. Noah smiled for the first time in what felt like forever. "I think I just got it back." The regional director stepped forward, confirming it. "You absolutely did," he said. He extended his hand. "Noah, we sincerely apologize for how you were treated. You didn't deserve any of it." Noah hesitated, then shook the man's hand. The director continued, "If you'd like to stay with the company, we'd be more than happy to reinstate you. And not just as a cashier, we're promoting you to assistant store manager." Noah's breath caught in his throat. The employees around him cheered even louder. Jessica gasped, squeezing Noah's arm. "Oh my God, Noah." His mind struggled to keep up. He had spent months working under Victor, thinking that hard work and kindness would never get him anywhere. He had spent years watching people like Victor abuse their power without consequence. And now? Now everything was different. He looked at the director. "You're serious?" The man nodded. "Very. You showed more leadership and integrity in one moment than Victor did in a decade." Noah swallowed hard. This was it. This was his moment. He nodded. "Then I accept." More cheers erupted around him. Shaq, standing beside him, clapped a firm hand on his shoulder. "Told you," he said with a smirk. Noah let out a small chuckle, shaking his head. "Yeah, you did." As the noise settled, Shaq turned to the employees still gathered, his voice carrying through the store. "All right, listen up," he said. "Things are gonna change around here." A few workers exchanged curious glances. Shaq continued. "First things first, everyone here is getting a raise, effective immediately." The store exploded into applause. One of the stock clerks, an older man who had been working at the store for over 15 years, looked like he might pass out. You mean that?" he stammered. Shaq nodded. "Damn right I do." The regional director stepped in, confirming it. "We'll be reviewing every employee's pay and adjusting accordingly." Victor kept this place running with a skeleton crew, while pocketing performance bonuses. That stops now. More cheers followed. Shaq raised a hand, signaling for quiet again. "Secondly, this company is going to start rewarding its employees for their hard work. That means better working conditions, better scheduling, and actual recognition for people who go above and beyond." Murmurs of agreement spread through the staff. Jessica, still standing near Noah, felt tears slip down her cheeks. She couldn't believe what she was witnessing. This wasn't just a victory. This was a complete shift in power. And it was all because Shaq had stepped in. She looked at him, swallowing thickly before stepping forward. "Mr. Turner," she said softly, "I don't know how to thank you for what you've done here." Shaq turned to her, his expression warm but serious. "You don't have to thank me," he said. "Just promise me one thing." Jessica nodded. "Anything?" Shaq gestured toward her son, who was looking up at him with wide, admiring eyes. "Take care of him. Make sure he grows up knowing that kindness isn't a weakness. It's the strongest thing a person can have." Jessica let out a small sob, then nodded. "I will. I promise." Shaq smiled. Then he turned back to Noah. "And you," he said. "Don't let this be the peak of your story. You got this opportunity. Do something with it." Noah straightened his shoulders. "I will." Shaq nodded once, then exhaled, clapping his hands together. "All right," he said with a grin. "Now, someone get me a damn receipt. I've got groceries to buy." The store erupted into laughter. The weight that had filled the space melted away, replaced with something else. Hope. Change. And the knowledge that, for once, the good guys had won. Noah, still in shock, finally found his voice. Is this really happening? Shaq turned to him. Yeah, kid. His smirk widened. And we're just getting started. The store would never be the same again. The echoes of celebration still lingered in the store. But for Noah Carter, the moment felt surreal. Just hours ago, he had been standing in this same spot, humiliated, convinced that his kindness had cost him everything. Now, everything had changed. He turned to Big Shaq, the man who had stepped in when no one else dared to. The man who had not only saved his job, but completely flipped his world upside down. Noah's voice was hoarse with emotion. Why would you do this for me? Shaq studied him for a moment before answering, his deep voice carrying the weight of experience. Because the world needs more people like you. He clapped a hand on Noah's shoulder, firm but reassuring. People who don't just look the other way when someone needs help. People who act. Noah swallowed hard. His entire life he had been taught that hard work and doing the right thing would pay off. But the world had always shown him otherwise, until now, until today. Jessica, standing just a few feet away with her son clinging to her hand, wiped a tear from her cheek. He's right, she said softly. Not many people would have done what you did, Noah. Noah shook his head. I wasn't trying to be a hero. He exhaled, his voice breaking slightly. I just didn't want a kid to go hungry. Shaq's expression softened. And that's exactly why I want you working for me. Noah blinked. Wait, what? Shaq smirked, crossing his arms. You heard me. His tone was casual, but there was something unmistakably serious in his offer. I own a few businesses. One of them could use someone like you. Someone who knows what it means to do the right thing, even when it's hard. Noah stared, his brain struggling to catch up. Are you serious? Shaq raised an eyebrow. Do I look like the kind of guy who jokes about life-changing job offers? A stunned chuckle escaped Noah. Not really. Shaq nodded. Then consider it official. If you want it, the job is yours. Noah felt his pulse in his ears. Just moments ago, he had been worried about how he would afford rent, how he would explain losing his job to his younger sister, how he would start over with nothing. Now, he was being offered an opportunity he never could have imagined. But still, doubt gnawed at him. I don't know, he admitted, rubbing the back of his neck. I mean, I've never done anything like that before. I've only ever worked retail. Shaq shrugged. So? You think I knew how to do half the things I do now when I first started? You learn as you go. Jessica stepped closer, her son peeking up at Noah with wide, hopeful eyes. You deserve this, she said softly. After everything you've been through. After everything you've done for others. Noah exhaled, feeling the weight of the moment settle over him. Then, he looked at Shaq and nodded, his decision made. I'm in. A grin spread across Shaq's face. Good choice. The employees around them, still lingering after Victor's humiliating exit, erupted into applause. For the first time in years, Noah felt like his life was moving forward. Not just surviving, but truly living. Jessica's son, who had been silent though most of the exchange, suddenly broke free from his mother's grasp and ran straight toward Shaq. The little boy wrapped his tiny arms around Shaq's waist, hugging him as tightly as he could. The entire store fell silent, watching. Shaq, caught off guard, looked down before smiling, placing a large, gentle hand on the boy's back. Thank you, the little voice said, muffled against Shaq's coat. Shaq crouched down to the boy's level, his expression soft. What's your name, kid? Caleb, the boy answered shyly. Well, Caleb, Shaq said, ruffling his hair, you don't have to thank me. Your mom's the real hero here. Caleb turned to look up at his mother, who had tears streaming down her face. But this time, they weren't from fear or stress. They were relieved, from hope. She mouthed a silent thank you to Shaq. He just nodded in return. The store eventually returned to normal, but something had changed in the air. The employees stood a little taller, no longer afraid of speaking up. Jessica and Caleb walked toward the doors, this time with more than just groceries, this time with security, knowing they weren't alone in the world. Noah? Noah was no longer just a cashier who got fired for doing the right thing. He was someone with a future, someone who had been seen, recognized, and given a second chance. As he and Shaq stepped outside, the cool evening air washing over them, Noah turned one last time, looking at the store he had thought he'd be stuck in forever. Now, it was just a chapter in his story, one that had finally turned a new page. A month had passed since that unforgettable night at the supermarket, but its ripple effects were still being felt. What had started as a simple act of kindness, one man stepping up for another, had transformed into something much bigger. The store, once ruled by fear and corporate greed, had undergone a complete transformation. The new leadership, led by a district manager who valued people over profit, had introduced long overdue changes. Employees were given raises, fair schedules, and a work environment where they felt respected rather than disposable. The tension that had once filled the aisles was gone, replaced with something rare in retail, a sense of pride in their work. And at the heart of it all was Noah Carter. No longer a cashier struggling to survive, he now stood at the front of the store as the assistant manager. His uniform was different, crisp, well-fitted, his name tag shining with his new title. But more than that, his confidence had changed. He walked with purpose, his shoulders squared, his eyes no longer filled with self-doubt. As he moved through the aisles, checking on employees, he was greeted with smiles, nods of respect. People listened when he spoke. They valued his leadership. He had gone from being invisible to being someone who mattered. But the best part? He never forgot where he came from. The evening rush had settled, leaving a quiet hum in the store as customers trickled through the aisles. Noah stood near the front, scanning the floor, when he noticed something. At register 4, an older woman clutched her purse, her hands trembling slightly as she stared at the total on the screen. Her face, lined with exhaustion, told a story all too familiar. The cashier, one of the newer hires, looked uncomfortable, glancing toward Noah for guidance. Noah didn't hesitate. He stepped forward, reaching into his pocket, pulling out his own wallet. With a quiet nod to the cashier, he covered the difference. The woman's eyes widened. "Oh no, I couldn't." Noah smiled gently. "It's already done." She blinked rapidly, emotion flickering across her face before she gripped his hands, squeezing them. "Thank you, young man." "Thank you." He simply nodded, watching as she took her bags and walked out with dignity, rather than shame. And just a few feet away, standing near the entrance, was Big Shaq. Shaq had been watching from a distance, his signature calm expression betraying just a hint of pride. He had come by to check in, to see how things had changed. He hadn't needed to say anything. Noah's actions had told him everything. As Noah turned, finally noticing him, Shaq just smiled, shaking his head slightly in amusement. "You really took my advice, huh?" Shaq mused. Noah shrugged, but there was a knowing glint in his eyes. "You said to do something with the opportunity. Figured I'd start here." Shaq nodded, glancing toward the doors where the woman had disappeared into the night. Now with food she didn't have to worry about affording. It was a simple act, one that most people might not even notice. But that was the whole point. Shaq exhaled, smiling to himself as he murmured under his breath, just loud enough for Noah to hear. "That's how you change the world." Noah said nothing, but the look in his eyes, determined, grateful, full of purpose, said it all. And with that, Shaq turned, heading toward the exit, knowing that the seed he had planted had already begun to grow. If this story moved you, imagine the impact of real-life kindness. One act can change someone's world, just like Noah's did. Don't let greed and injustice win. Stand up, speak out, and always choose to help. Like, share, and subscribe to spread this powerful message. Let's make the world a better place, one good deed at a time.